Hey everyone, this is Curtis here, and today on KTF we're going to be talking about are character loyalists viable for tournaments. So let's jump into the topic. So first we have to describe of what a character loyalist is, or what does that mean? It essentially means that a player is dedicated to a single character for competitive play. So in the terms of fighting games, if you are playing Street Fighter and you only play Ryu, no matter what happens, so if Ryu gets nerfed, you're still picking Ryu. A lot of times when a new game comes out, you're still playing Ryu, and it doesn't even matter of what your opponent picks. No matter what, you're going into it and you're playing Ryu. That's basically what we're talking. And with fighting games, should we select a single character or should we create a pool of characters? And that's the alternative that we're looking at. And what does a character pool entail? A character pool just takes the giant roster of available characters in that fighting game and just tries to shrink it down that you're only playing a few. So you have essentially main characters, but you also have in certain situations or in certain matchups that you're going to play a different character. And so you have that kind of mindset. And when you're entering in tournaments, a very standard format is a first to two kind of format. And so you may have your loyal character or your main character play first, but what happens if now you know what your opponent's character is? Should we make a decision off of that? And that's what a character pool helps. It helps us dictate a decision based on what our opponent's actions are being done. Also, creating a character pool minimizes any risks that happen if meta shifts or characters become nerfed. You have a pool of characters, and so your overall performance in tournaments should show very little fluctuations rather than just selecting one character, them getting nerfed, and just kind of dragging it down. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. What we want to explore a little bit more is this kind of tournament format. So our main goal is to win games. It's not to have fun, it's not to experiment, it's not to create cool combos. We are there to win. And so we need to really analyze this first to two format. And this can be used for first to three, first to sevens, whatever, but we're just going to focus on first to two. And the terminology that we're using is, if you're that character loyalist, no matter what, you're just going to have a lead character and you're just going to play that character regardless of what your opponent does, regardless of if the building's on fire or not. No matter what, you're playing that character. Comparatively with the character pool, we're introducing a couple more terms. And there are more terms, but these are kind of the main ones you need to consider. You have your lead character. This is essentially the character that you feel is your main, that you're going to play first. So if you have no knowledge of what your opponent is being played, so if you sit down in a random set in a tournament, you don't know who this is, you're going to select your lead character. But these instances come up that you may want to then, having prior knowledge of what your opponent is, you want to hard counter pick, meaning you are going to select a character matchup that you're going to select the character that has the higher chance of winning or has an advantage against your opponent's character. And then soft counters are a little bit more complicated because not only does it look to select a character that has an advantage over your opponents, but it's also to minimize kind of the counterpick potential versus yours, in which we've seen counterpick on counterpick on counterpick. That has happened in the past. It's becoming less popular in recently, but that's kind of the mindset of, well, if I make this decision, then my opponent may make a future decision, that type of thing. So these are just main topics or main terms that we want to discuss: the lead character, hard counter characters, and soft counter characters. And the easiest way to kind of explain this, because I'm trying not to get too number heavy, but we need to explain it with numbers. And so let's first look at the very basic rock, paper, scissor mechanic. And this is written out in a payoff matrix using game theory. So on the column, so the first column, we have rock, paper, scissors. That's player one's decision of or what character they're picking. Rather than on the top row, that's showing what players' two selections are. And how we read this payoffs is the first selection is for player one and the second selection is for player two. So if, for an example, if player one selected paper and player two selected rock, player one would win, which is denoted with a +1, and player two would lose, denoted as a -1. This is just very general game theory terms. And rock, paper, scissors is a very classical example. And a lot of times, and we know that rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, and paper beats rock. That's the general trend, and there's zero variance that comes into play. Rather than just looking at rock, paper, scissors as it stands, we're going to look at a different variant of rock, paper, scissors, in which now rock won't always beat scissors, scissors won't always beat paper, and paper won't always beat rock. This is to help simulate what happens when you're selecting a character. Just because you're selecting a character that has an advantage doesn't guarantee a win. You have a higher probability of winning, and that's what we're trying to show this here. And so we're assigning probabilities of winning, and then we're also having a lock, meaning once you've won with a certain selection, you are fixed to it. So for instance, if I throw rock and I win with rock, I now have to continue selecting rock while my opponent is able to change to whatever they want. And so hopefully my opponent has paper in their character pool to get a better advantage versus my rock. And that's kind of what we're exploring. Well, we also see something a little different is because we're dealing with probabilities, our payoff matrix looks a little bit different. Rather than being separated by player one's payoff and player two's payoff, we've just simplified this to player one's perspective. And in our previous example, if player one selected paper and player two selected rock, it was a guaranteed win for player one. But in this case, with probability, player one has a probability of winning at 70% with that paper versus rock. Another example, just real quick, is if player one selected rock and player two selected rock, there would be an even chance, meaning it's not a tie and then you throw again. There is going to be a solid outcome of that match. And so we're going to explore that a little bit more. And so rather than the trade-off of constantly beating, now there's probabilities attached to each of the kind of different matchups that can occur. And this is again from player one's perspective. And so how we're going to evaluate this is the payoffs or the expected values in a first to two format, and the cumulative probability is going to be calculated to see what are the player one's chances of winning versus player two's chances of winning using different strategies. Remember, we all started about, is Character Loyalist viable for tournaments? This is the numeric evidence that we're going to present to show if loyalists are viable or they're not. In which this is looking again from player one's perspective and evaluating player one's win percentages versus player one's loss percentages and all the different variations. So a game can finish with player one just winning 2 games immediately, then the set is over, or they can win 1 and then lose 1 and then win 1, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to do is build an example that kind of works through this to evaluate it. So in this example, player one is selecting rock, and that is a character loyalist, meaning it will never change. No matter what your opponent is doing, they're always selecting rock. And in this case, we also have player two that is also a character loyalist, and they are playing scissors. So rock generally beats scissors. And so we've put in the probabilities of all the different situations using the previous table to then help us calculate. And that final column of product is just the product of everything in that row, meaning that we just multiplied each of those constants together to then have that calculation. So 60% times 60% is 36%, that type of thing. And then we're going to add up that entire product column, and that's where we get the cumulative win probability for player one. And so in the scenario that rock beats scissor, in a single event, rock has a 60% chance of winning. But in a first to two format, where both characters are character loyalists with rock and scissors, the rock player actually has a 64.8% chance of winning. So we see cumulative benefits with an advantage player. And now this is the best scenario for rock because rock has the highest advantage versus scissors compared to any other situation. And rather than just kind of going through each of the scenarios, I'll let you do that on your own if you want to do that. I'll have a summary in just a little bit. But instead of just a loyalist for a loyalist, the next scenario is, what if we have a loyalist versus a pool player? So in this scenario, player 1 is locked again with Rock. He is a character loyalist. He's never changing away from Rock. While we have a pool player with player 2, in which his lead character is going to be a Scissors, and then we're going to assume that he can play and he can choose every other option that's out there. And again, we are just plugging in all the probabilities that are associated with the probability of winning versus losing with that specific matchup. And we went from a 64% chance of winning for player 1 down to a 37%. So even though game 1 is heavily favored for player 1, because the refusal to change character compared to the pool player is able to implement strategies to greatly increase their chances of winning, even though game 1 is very unfavorable matchup. So this leads us to really good evidence that, maybe character viability isn't the greatest. But now let's look at one more scenario in which it's a pool player versus a pool player. This time, player 1 is a pool player who is with the lead character of Rock, and player 2 is also a pool player with the lead character of Scissors. What we have here is the rest of the probabilities filled in for each of the percentages along with the cumulative probability, which when both players are using the pool strategy, it actually gets to down to a 55 essentially percent chance of winning for player 1. So player 1 still has an advantage only from kind of that game 1, but because that each of them are doing counter picking to essentially maximize their probabilities of winning as an individual based on their opponent, the new result is much closer to 50%. And so while there was character advantages that look to be presented, they're essentially get eliminated the further and further that we actually have kind of a first to 5 or whatever. And that's due just to cumulative probabilities, but it's making the decisions of changing it up, having a pool. So on this next slide, we have the summary of each of the different possibilities of your strategies of loyalists versus pool players. We only talked about the Rock and Scissor matchups, and we have that summary. And if you want to take the little bit extra time to kind of crunch the numbers on each of the other situations, you're more than welcome to go ahead. But we definitely can now draw conclusions that character loyalists are not tournament viable. This is primarily because players that use a character pool will strictly dominate a character loyalist. They will always have an advantage, even if on game 1 they have a disadvantage. They're going to make it up because it's not just a best of one type of event. Let it be known that the margin of that domination will largely depend on the game. That's where matchup chart analysis comes into play. Rather than tier lists, we care about matchup chart analysis. And what we can also draw from this is we assume that no other characteristics mattered. So player skill or whatever, if you threw Rock, everyone throws Rock at the same proficiency, everything else, all it is about character selection. That's what we can draw from this. And the character pool also allows us for additional counterpicking strategies, which we're not going to discuss now, but further down the road, it can be really interesting depending on the rules that are present. Some additional thoughts, though, to kind of take with a grain of salt is why should you be a character loyalist? Branding is a huge thing. If you are solidified to a single character, that's how you're going to get people to possibly follow you a lot easier. Winning is generally a secondary factor. You're more interested of exploring that character and just doing really cool shit. And there's really nothing wrong with that if you're just having fun. That personal drive, that's the most important thing. Rather than winning. And if that personal drive is to win, then you don't be a character loyalist. You be a pool player. You got to put the time in. And loyalists are just less time intensive. You just have to learn one character and then all the matchups of how to respond to it. But move lists of just one rather than all the very fine details of switching a character and knowing specific situations. Well, why you have to have a character pool is that you want to reduce that character disadvantage at all times. So it's more about preserving what you have versus your opponent. Yes, you take advantage of your opponent when they've made kind of an unoptimal pick, and so then you can take advantage of it. But mostly it's to protect your own self. Having a character pool also makes you much more difficult to prepare against, rather than having rather than just being a character loyalist and sticking to one character. So your opponents already know who you are, or even if you have two characters, they know how to prepare just against those two characters. If you have a diverse roster that's in your character pool, you're going to be very hard to be singled out and targeted, even practiced against, to prepare for. And that's mainly for a super high end to make it more difficult for you to be dethroned. Now, this big caveat is that it's a very time intensive. The defense options are all kind of the same. You know the scenarios. You may have to remember a few different inputs here and there, but it's the offenses of each of the characters that you're going to have to learn is going to be a little bit different, and of either looking at frames or different advantages, or even just overall strategies. If you're a zoner main, but then your secondary character is a grappler or some gorilla, those are going to play just mentally very differently of how you approach that strategy. And so it could be very time intensive to create that diverse character roster. And then, of course, having the character pool, you will then be able to influence actually counterpick strategies and even character strategies of how you approach that to just gain a bigger advantage over your opponent. So overall, I think we have seen enough evidence that you should not be a character loyalist if your primary goal is to win. So if you're a tournament player, you need to expand your roster. It's not up to me to say who to expand it to. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in matchup chart analysis, or even the number. That number can also be derived in matchup chart analysis. But for now, I think we've answered the questions. Are character loyalists viable in tournaments? And again, no, they're not.